We are talking today with Melvin Goodman. Melvin Goodman is a former CIA and State Department analyst. He is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and director of the center's National Security Project. He has taught national security issues at the National War College, Johns Hopkins, and the American University. From 1966 to 1986, he was a senior CIA Soviet analyst, and he is also co-author of the book Bush League Diplomacy, How the Neoconservatives Are Putting the World at Risk. If we could begin, tell us what was the circumstances with your choosing a job at the CIA?
Well, I was in graduate school in Russian studies at Indiana University, and this was in the mid-'60s, and I was getting restless with my graduate studies, and it seemed the government was an option, so I considered the Foreign Service, and I considered the CIA. And I decided to go to the CIA because of their interest in my dissertation topic and their interest in the Soviet field, whereas the Foreign Service has a much more generalist outlook about who comes in and what you're trained to do when you work for the Department of State overseas. So the CIA became a natural career path for me. I thought I would do it for 2 or 3 years, and then I would finish my dissertation and go back to teaching. Well, it took me 5 or 6 years to finish my dissertation, but in the early 70s, I took a leave of absence and went up to the University of Connecticut in Storrs. And I found I missed the Washington scene, I missed the intelligence business, I missed the immediacy of working on analytical issues involving the Soviet Union and U.S. foreign policy. So after 2 years, I came back, and then I stayed until the mid-'80s when the corruption process set in at the CIA under the director, William Casey, and his deputy, Robert Gates, who is now the Secretary of Defense, which I find ironic. And so I left again and went to the National War College and taught there until 2004.
Okay, hopefully we can get back to Robert Gates.
I hope we do at some point.
When you first started, that was when the Vietnam War was really escalating. How did that work its way into your job?
Well, it worked its way into my situation in 2 ways. One, I alienated just about every liberal friend I had in graduate school. And actually, when you're in a Russian studies program at a graduate school such as Indiana University, you're dealing mainly with a rather liberal, progressive type of individual. And they were shocked. A couple of people stopped talking to me. I had a professor who dropped off my committee, my Soviet foreign policy guru on my dissertation committee, felt it was a betrayal to be leaving graduate school to go to the CIA. And then when I got to the CIA, then I thought, my goodness, it is during the Vietnam War. I was very opposed to the Vietnam War. I was involved in the teach-in movement at Indiana, and I marched in all the major Vietnam rallies, anti-war rallies in the 60s and in the early 70s. But actually, where I worked on the analytical side, the Directorate of Intelligence, was a rather liberal group to begin with, and there was a lot of opposition to the war. And fortunately, I never worked on Vietnam directly. I always worked on Soviet foreign policy, and in that period, I was working mainly on the Middle East. So I worked on the 67 war, and the 69 War of Attrition, and of course the October War of 1973, and not Vietnam directly. But I got involved in the intelligence, knowing that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was based on a bogus piece of intelligence with regard to how an intercept was interpreted incorrectly and then politicized to create the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So I got an early exposure to the danger of politicization, particularly when a political group, any administration in the White House, takes a piece of intelligence and runs with it for their own purposes. And of course, this had a lot to do with how we got into the Iraq War, but in the Iraq War, the CIA was definitely a lot more complicit than it was in the 1960s. So it was an interesting learning experience right on. And I must say one final point is I was somewhat naive about the CIA. I looked at the CIA as a large intelligence library, like the greatest library of classified materials in all of Washington. All of your defense attaché reports from the Pentagon came there. All of your Department of State Foreign Service officer cables came there. The intercepts for the National Security Agency came there. Satellite photography came there and was analyzed by CIA analysts. And frankly, I felt I was pushing the envelope every day on these serious analytical issues. And I found it rather rewarding. And for the first 15 years, I enjoyed what I was doing very much. Bill Casey brought this to a halt in 1981, but that's a different story.
So up to that point when the Gulf of Tonkin data was used, did you feel that the agency really hadn't been politicized prior to that?
I don't think it was politicized internally until Bill Casey in the 1980s. There was an exercise in politicization, however, and that took place in the mid-1970s. But that was politicization from the outside. That was an external process. And it's kind of ironic when you go back to that period. It was the mid-1970s. It was that short period when Gerald Ford was president after the Nixon debacle. And, of course, Ford was supported by a Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, a very familiar name, and a Chief of Staff, Dick Cheney, another very familiar name. And Cheney and Rumsfeld were always opposed to the Central Intelligence Agency. They were always opposed to the idea of independent analysis. And they felt that the CIA was a liberal institution, which, again, I felt ironic given the problems I had with my liberal friends. Now I'm in an institution where I'm accused of being too liberal by the government, about the powers that be. So, of course, Cheney and Rumsfeld came up with a scheme called Team A, Team B. CIA would be Team A, and Team B would be led by people such as Richard Pipes, the hardline professor from Harvard, Paul Wolfowitz, who helped to bring us the war against Iraq and is now having a lot of fun for the whole country at the World Bank, a great source of humor for all of us. And you had all of these right-wing players introduced to the CIA, pushing our analysis to the right. And to a certain degree, they were successful. And, of course, the irony there was they were pushing CIA analysis on the Soviet Union to the right as the Soviet Union was becoming aware of its own economic weaknesses in the mid and late 1970s and began to indicate to us that they wanted arms control, they wanted disarmament, they wanted détente, they wanted a new relationship with the United States, as you had Cheney and Rumsfeld pushing CIA intelligence in another direction. So this was a bizarre period in the 24 years that I was at the CIA, quite unusual.
You had mentioned the 67 war. Were you privy to any intelligence about what had happened with the USS Liberty at that time?
Oh, yes. There were two important intelligence issues very early on in the war. One involved with how the war started, when it was clear that Israel preempted, and we had the intelligence to support that. And I helped to write the situation report that went to the White House, and it came back from Walt Rostow saying, this cannot be right. We have assurances from the Israelis they would not preempt. And we had to go to the Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms, about what do we do with this? We've just given the White House our best analysis, and they've rejected it. And he said, send it back to them. So we sent it back to them. So I got a very important education now about the importance of telling truth to power. And Richard Helms, even though I think he ultimately corrupted himself over Chile in the 1970s, was someone who believed that the CIA existed to keep the White House honest, to tell them what the intelligence was with the bark on, and if it was an uncomfortable message, so be it. The USS Liberty was a very discouraging experience for a lot of us because we were convinced that the Israeli attack was quite intentional. The Israelis had to know what they were doing. They had warned us about the ship close to their waters. The ship was a U.S. naval ship, but it was seconded to the National Security Agency. And what it was doing was picking up all of the essential intercepts from Israeli military traffic, basically giving us their war plan. So we knew what day one was going to be, we knew what day two was going to be, and we knew what they were going to be doing on day three. And they told us, get that ship out of those waters. The bizarre thing to me about the ship is why it didn't have any air cover. If it had a modest amount of air cover, I don't think the Israelis would have attacked it. That's stupid. They wouldn't have been. But it never dawned on me that this was an accident, that this was, as the British like to say, a cock-up to some extent. A terrible irony in all of this is a message was sent out to the Liberty to back away from those waters because of the Israeli warnings, and that message was misrouted and took longer to get there than it should have, and by then it was too late. So there was no doubt in my mind that the attack was quite purposeful, quite intentional. And the reason why Lyndon Johnson didn't want to do anything about it was two things. One, he was in the middle of a Vietnam War that was essentially not out of control yet because the Tet Offensive came months later. And he didn't want to take on Israel and the Jewish American lobby at that particular juncture, and we tried to smooth over the relationship with Israel. I think Israel ultimately paid some reparations, but never took on responsibility for the attack. It was always considered to be a serious mistake, but no more than that. But I think our group, when we looked at all of the materials, were convinced this had to be intentional.
Richard Helms was a name I hadn't heard in a long time. What do you see as the big differences between him and then when Bill Casey came in?
Well, the thing about Richard Helms that had to be appreciated when you were at the CIA in the 1960s is our analysis, and this can be, anyone can look this up now, go to the Pentagon Papers, the classified history of the war that Daniel Ellsberg helped to declassify, and go to the annexes, and you can read the CIA estimates on Vietnam. Now, if a policymaker was reading those estimates, they would have known that the use of military force in Vietnam in a civil war situation was going to fail. And the CIA estimates and analysis and special assessments all made it clear military intervention wouldn't work. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt. Escalation of bombing would have no impact over the long run. And then there was a serious issue where Helms initially gave some backing to the analyst, the late Sam Adams, who through the processes of his own imagination and methodology found out that there were twice as many Viet Cong as we formerly believed in South Vietnam and as the Pentagon believed. So it was clear to all of us that we had the wrong number of forces in Vietnam if we were going to be there at all. It was questionable whether we should have been there, but we had to be there with more forces because the Viet Cong was twice as strong as we thought it was. And initially, Helms brought this intelligence downtown, but after a period of rejections and a question of do I want to be the messenger who gets shot day in, day out, Helms sort of backed off this intelligence. And Sam Adams was told, go work on something else. Of course, they gave him the job of working on Cambodia, and he found out the Cambodian problem was a lot worse than we thought it was originally. But I was proud of my colleagues during that period. There were major disputes within the CIA over the intelligence, and some of it was very controversial. Intelligence by nature doesn't deal with truth. It deals with factual material, and it's often incomplete, and you don't have all the stones you need on that mosaic to make it clear in your own mind what the picture is and what it's all about. But I think the system worked to a certain extent. And in a sense, why this war in Iraq is so different, the White House asked very serious substantive questions, particularly the Johnson administration, but also the Nixon administration, about Vietnam and about what we knew about Vietnam. During the run-up to the Iraq War, the White House didn't ask the CIA for any information or any intelligence other than to support the decision that had already been made, which led us to George Tenet and his famous or infamous slam dunk about what he could provide to the White House. So in a sense, during Vietnam, and I consider the Iraq War a much greater tragedy than Vietnam, because even though I was opposed to Vietnam, I also understood, being a student of containment and having read all of George Kennan's works, and he was sort of a hero to me when I was in graduate school, I knew how we blundered into Vietnam. Iraq was something we created out of whole cloth that'll never make any sense to me. I still don't understand what we thought we were doing in Iraq and the decision to go in. But again, in the 60s and early 70s, the process was working, and that intelligence was a vital part of some of the decision-making. It wasn't always adhered to or listened to or even comprehended in some cases. But it was a support mechanism in policymaking. And in Iraq, it had no role to play whatsoever other than to create intelligence out of whole cloth or politicize intelligence to support the decision to go to war. And that's what's so different about Vietnam and Iraq, and that's why it's dangerous to try to draw parallels in these situations. You know, people always say history repeats itself, and I always respond, yes, history repeats itself, but each time it's different.
So you had said earlier that you finally left the agency when things were getting politicized, when Robert Gates was getting involved in things.
In 1981, that was the turning point. And I could see the writing was on the wall. First, he became the deputy director for intelligence under Casey in 1982, and then he became Casey's deputy as CIA director in 84, 85. And there was one special assessment that the CIA did that was the turning point, and I decided to leave. and that was in 1985. Casey always believed that the assassination attempt against the Pope in 1981 was a Soviet plot. There was no intelligence to support that whatsoever. In fact, and we wrote a lot of the briefings that Bob Gates gave on the Hill. And as late as 1984, winter of 84-85, he told the Hill there's no intelligence to support the notion of a Soviet involvement. In fact, there's good intelligence that says the Soviets weren't involved. But in 1985, a terrible report came in from Bulgaria from a third-hand source who was in military intelligence and not KGB intelligence, therefore didn't even have the access to this kind of information, that said the Soviet KGB was involved. The report was so bad that the operations people weren't even going to issue it. But Bill Casey, who considered himself the great white case officer as the director of CIA, liked to see these raw reports. And when he saw this one, he said, here's our shooting gun, here's the smoking gun. Go write this report I've been wanting you to write for the last 4 years. Now, all this was happening in secret. I didn't know about this. I found out about it a month or so later when I was in someone's office and happened to see on a desk something about the papal plot. And as a good intelligence officer, you learn to read upside down. And I started reading the first few paragraphs, and I said, oh, my God, what in the world are we writing? So when I got a chance, I went back to the office when that woman, who was one of the analysts working on the paper, wasn't there. I took it and Xeroxed it. And I went to my boss, and I eventually went to Bob Gates, who was the deputy director for intelligence, and said, this is an integrity issue. You're taking a very dubious report, and with that single source, this is just what happened in Iraq. It was the same methodology when you look at all the accusations about why we had to go into the war, and you're writing this. And Bob and I had been longtime friends since the day he arrived at CIA. That was sort of the end of our friendship, and that was the beginning of my decision that I've got to find another place to work. This wasn't going to work out. I did what I could in terms of responding to this bogus memo that was then circulated only to the president, the vice president, secretaries of state and defense, and maybe 2 or 3 other people. But in 1986, I left to go to the National War College. It was time to leave.
So that's interesting that you were friends. So did he just see that his career would be taking a better direction if he started doing these things?
Oh, Bob was the classic careerist, classic apparatchik. I just consider him a windsock. He would blow in the direction of the prevailing wind, and the prevailing wind in this case, in terms of Bill Casey, was a direct hardline position. The Soviets were responsible for all acts of mischief around the world. They were responsible for international terrorism. They were responsible for the papal plot. And Bob Gates was sort of the intelligence filter for Bill Casey's raw ideas. So he became the implementer of the designs that Bill Casey had, and the major design was to stop the détente policy of George Shultz in Reagan's second term from 84 to 88, which was quite successful, where you had a 180-degree shift in presidential policy on the Soviet Union. Reagan, the first term, the Soviets were the evil empire. In the second term, there was one arms control after another. And this infuriated Bill Casey, and Bob Gates was the key implementer of this strategy to politicize the intelligence, create a hardline view of the Soviet Union, and hopefully bring George Shultz's détente policy to a halt.
And hadn't you actually worked on some of those policies towards the removal of the weapons?
Well, in 71, 72, I was the intelligence advisor to the SALT delegation. So I was in Vienna, and I was in Vienna on the Great Breakthrough Round, which took place in 71, when it was clear that the Soviet Union and the United States had broken through domestic opposition and were going to move toward 2 very important arms control agreements, the SALT I Treaty of 1972, and more importantly, in some ways, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty of 1972, which, of course, the Bush administration has now abrogated. This was the major breakthrough in arms control policy. I think it was very important that Henry Kissinger lent his support to this kind of arms control. But to me, he couldn't have done it without an honest CIA standing up to the Pentagon and saying that the SS-9 missile was not a MIRV, a multi-independent warhead missile, and that their surface-to-air missile system could not be upgraded to an ABM system. So with that knowledge, and the CIA almost stood alone in defending these positions, but we eventually were proven to be correct, Henry Kissinger and the Nixon administration supported arms control and disarmament. And it's kind of interesting to me that here is two hard-nosed realists, Nixon and Kissinger, believed in the importance of dialogue, of diplomacy, of arms control, of disarmament, of negotiation, and these very important treaties. And now here it is 30 years later, you have an administration that's totally out of control, that's opposed to arms control, opposed to negotiation, opposed to Russia, opposed to any of the aspects and instruments of détente that we saw working 30 years ago. And again, it should be no surprise that the two people who got us into the war and helped the president into this war were, of course, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, and these are the same positions they took in 1975 and 1976. Not only were they hostile to the CIA, they were hostile to Henry Kissinger, they were hostile to the Soviet Union, they were hostile to arms control, they stopped all of the arms control negotiations, there was no progress toward SALT II. So here is history repeating itself in a very provocative way and a very destructive way for American policy. And I don't think this is something that's well understood out there in the general public or in the intellectual community, in the academic community, about the revisiting of these issues by Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense.
You mentioned that there was domestic opposition to the early SALT treaty. Can you define what that domestic opposition would have been?
Well, the domestic opposition was not well formed because I don't think people really expected these negotiations to go anywhere. Remember, they were supposed to start in 1968. Lyndon Johnson, even before Nixon came into power a year later, wanted to move toward a SALT agreement, an arms control agreement. But when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, that ended any hope for Johnson to pursue an arms control agreement. Nixon and Kissinger waited a year. They wasted a lot of time, but they did prepare the substantive backstopping for negotiating an arms control agreement, which is a very difficult process. And I don't think the public understands how hard civil servants and foreign policy experts work at these matters and how tenacious you have to be and rigorous you have to be in negotiating an arms control treaty, but I don't think the right wing had really organized for it. But there were people like Cheney and Rumsfeld who were opposed to arms control, but the real movement came later in the 1970s when you had the Committee on the Present Danger, consisting mainly of Democrats who moved toward the right. And since we are in Seattle, of course, two of the leading neocons of their day at that time were working for your Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. And, of course, their names are Richard Dick Pearl and Dorothy Fosdick, who were opposed to arms control in the 1970s. And Dick Pearl, we know, stayed opposed to arms control for the next 30 years. So when this opposition group formed, we didn't hear a lot about them because in 1981, one of them was, in a sense, elected president. With Ronald Reagan, you didn't need an active opposition group. All you needed was Ronald Reagan spouting his evil empire language and blaming the Soviets on terrorism, which was Bill Casey's point of view. And it took 4 years for someone like George Shultz to turn Ronald Reagan's thinking in a direction that, you can do business with the Soviet Union. This is a serious crowd of people. They have their positions, but I think we can come away with arms control agreements that are satisfactory. And, of course, Dick Pearl resigned from the Reagan administration in 1986-87 because of the intermediate nuclear force agreement of that period. He and the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. So, again, we see these issues have come up before, and these were the neoconservatives of their day who were opposed to them. And when they didn't have a president who was satisfactory to their interests, whether it was Jimmy Carter in the late 70s or Bill Clinton in the 1990s, they worked extremely intensely to work against the arms control agreements this crowd came up with. In the case of Bill Clinton, it was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which this country and the international community really needs. but we don't have a comprehensive test ban treaty. One, because the CIA had an intelligence failure in 1998 when they missed 5 nuclear tests in India. And then George Tenet, who I never thought was the sharpest tool in the shed to begin with, went down to the Hill and said, we can't verify a comprehensive test ban treaty. And any serious scientist who's worked on these interests knows darn well that we can. This was an intelligence failure because we had given a lot of this intelligence over to the Pentagon, which doesn't care at all about arms control and is actively opposed to arms control and always has been, going back to the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and 1964 under then President John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson. So I think a lot of this history has been lost, and in the process, the arms control lobby has become so weak in the United States. And then you had the efforts of Jesse Helms, the senator from North Carolina, to kill off the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In a way, we have a lot of lobbying interests and support groups for war and for military power. We don't have any lobbying institutions and government agencies that support peace and détente and arms control and disarmament. And when you think about all the money we put into war and readiness for war and preparedness for war, why don't we put some of that money, not a large amount, it wouldn't take a huge amount, into peace studies, into conflict resolution, into conflict management, into arms control and disarmament. But a lot of this has been lost to the political culture, and I think this is very unfortunate.
Has all the opposition to arms control coming from the Pentagon and elsewhere, is that because of the money involved with arms production, or what do you think is the reason for that?
Well, I think the reason is quite simple, and it goes back to President Eisenhower's farewell address of 1961 and the warning he gave us about the military-industrial complex. And actually, when you go back to the original speech, he wrote in where it said military-industrial complex, a speech that was written to a large extent by a professor at Hopkins, Malcolm Moose, who then went on to the University of Minnesota, I think, to become president. Eisenhower, in his own hand, added congressional. So as he was about to give the speech, it was going to be military-industrial congressional monopoly. And at the last minute, he took out congressional. And his brother, who was then the president of Johns Hopkins University, where I was an undergraduate, Milton Eisenhower, said to him, "Why did you take out congressional?" And he said, "Well, it was enough for me to take on the military and the industrial. It was probably too much to expect any one person to take on the military, industrial, and congressional triangle." But he said, it's indeed that. So I think that was the support group for the military budgets, for the kind of procurement strategy we propose, the opposition to arms control. And I even look at Donald Rumsfeld. You know, why did Donald Rumsfeld come back to Washington in 2001 to be a Secretary of Defense, a job he had already held under Gerald Ford that didn't promise anything for him at that particular time? I don't think it was to go to war against Iraq. For Donald Rumsfeld, it was to do the militarization of space, to get into the next area of an arms control buildup, kill the ABM treaty, which he did, start the first serious appropriations for national missile defense, which he did, now expand that NMD system, the national missile defense, to Europe, and it'll probably go into Poland and the Czech Republic, which Rumsfeld would have approved of. And of course, then 9/11 came, threw a lot of this into a cocked hat, and then you had support for the war against Iraq, something that I think George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Paul Wolfowitz wanted to do all along, and then Donald Rumsfeld became a late supporter. But then he became an earlier, I think, than most people realize, critic of that war, which is why I think he was pushed into resigning. The conventional wisdom is that Rumsfeld was forced to resign because of the election results in November. I think that's nonsense. Donald Rumsfeld was forced to resign because he was losing his enthusiasm about the war and wanted to scale down our presence and wasn't a supporter of the surge. And that's why, and another irony, they turn around and they go to Bob Gates, who was close to the Bush family, who was dean of the George Bush School of Public Policy at Texas A&M, and then president of Texas A&M, and is a complete supporter of all of the policies of Dick Cheney and George Bush in Iraq. So here you have Bob Gates, who politicized the intelligence in the 1980s, coming back to Washington to conduct and manage and be the steward of a war that we entered into with politicized intelligence. So he's a master at his craft. You say what you want about Bob Gates, he knows how to politicize information and politicize intelligence and stick with a policy, even a failing policy such as the one we're pursuing in Iraq.
I know you literally spoke out against him heading the CIA back in 91?
1991.
Do you feel that there was more opposition to him gaining that post then than there was now when he got Secretary of Defense?
Oh, no question, because in 1991, I testified over a several-day period, started out in closed session, then moved into open session. And in the vote, there were over 30 votes against Bob Gates as CIA director, which is more than all of the votes, again, and involving all of the CIA directors going back to 1947 when the CIA was created. So this was a very controversial appointment. But when I went to lobby against Bob Gates, and I went down to the Hill and spent a couple of days basically going door to door, there was a little bit of sympathy for my position, and some people even remember the testimony in 1991, but they looked at Bob Gates as the morning after pill. He was going to abort Donald Rumsfeld, and as long as Bob Gates was Bob Gates and not Donald Rumsfeld, they weren't going to vote against him. And I think ultimately, two senators voted against Donald Rumsfeld, and that was for the entirely wrong reasons anyway. And they were just glad that Donald Rumsfeld was moving on. And people had really forgotten. They no longer cared about his involvement in Iran-Contra. They didn't care that he lied about that in 1987, therefore he couldn't be confirmed when Ronald Reagan nominated him to be the CIA director. They remembered about 1991, but they didn't want to relive that history. They just didn't want to go into that. They wanted Donald Rumsfeld to go to his home on the Eastern Shore and get very quiet. They had seen enough of Donald Rumsfeld. So there was no interest in raising any legitimate issues with regard to Bob Gates.
There currently seems to be a trend at the Pentagon for silencing generals from speaking out in opposition to U.S. policy in the war and probably other things as well. Do you think that that's coming through Bob Gates?
I can't. It's hard for me to blame Bob Gates for that, even though the retired military community has become much quieter since Donald Rumsfeld has resigned. And actually, I'm not sure I blame Donald Rumsfeld for the weakness of our general officers to respond to the poor policy that went into this war. I think too much of it was self-censorship. I don't think our general officers, and I taught at the National War College for 18 years, where senior officers get a master's degree in national strategy, and a lot of them go on to become general officers and flag officers. They're not critical analysts to begin with, and it's not a natural thing for them to do to oppose national policy. And here I think it's somewhat tragic, even though you don't want generals running off in all of their own directions. But there was a Goldwater-Nichols bill in 1986 that it created a much more powerful Joint Chiefs of Staff structure in which generals were educated on the basis that you are, particularly the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you are the president's military advisor. And I think it's regrettable, just as generals didn't take their complaints about the Vietnam War to the White House in the 1960s, generals didn't take their complaints with Donald Rumsfeld's lack of planning for the war or the post-war period, for that matter, to the White House. Now, again, it's like the intelligence issues. It wouldn't have mattered. This is an administration that wanted to go to war, and nothing was going to get in the way. Intelligence wasn't going to get in the way. Military opposition wasn't going to get in the way. Domestic opposition, if there had been any, wasn't going to get in the way. Congress was sort of AWOL during this process and didn't want to get engaged. And the media, I think, took a pass on all this, too. And I think the sad thing about all of this, the larger lesson, is what's happening to our constitutional system. I personally believe we're in a constitutional crisis. We went off to war with phony intelligence, bogus intelligence, politicized intelligence. I think these are very serious issues. Our media did nothing to take advantage of its First Amendment rights regarding freedom of the press to educate the American people on the contrarian views about the war. The Congress didn't do its job. The courts defer on national security affairs to the administration and don't want to take up the serious issues involving torture and abuse, renditions where the CIA is out there kidnapping people and turning them over to the intelligence services of Middle Eastern countries where they're regularly and routinely tortured and abused, and this whole system of secret prisons. And frankly, if it hadn't been for the press getting back on its feet, James Risen at the New York Times with regard to the warrantless eavesdropping, which is a violation of the Fourth Amendment about illegal searches and seizures, and Dana Priest of the Washington Post, who brought us information about the secret prisons in Eastern Europe, ironically some of them in former Soviet Gulag institutions in countries such as Poland, and then terrible and ugly renditions where a German citizen was rendered from the Balkans and ended up in a jail where he was tortured in Afghanistan, someone who was totally innocent of all of these charges. And then we know about the Canadian who ended up in Syria. The Canadian government is about to pay this poor individual reparations. We're still keeping this guy's name on a terrorist list. He can't get on a plane in the United States, and I'm sure he doesn't want to go near the United States again. So there are a lot of things that sort of threaten our security and liberty that the American people aren't talking about. And since I raised the Eisenhower farewell address, when he raised the military-industrial complex, he linked it to our democratic processes. That's what's at stake. That if the abuses of the military and industrial complex continue, it will be our security. That will not necessarily be strengthened, but it will be our liberty that will suffer and our democratic processes will suffer. And I still think we're beginning to see that. And we're not getting the proper reaction from the American people, from the Congress, and from the courts of the land, particularly the Supreme Court. So these are very serious times and very serious issues.
So the military-industrial complex, do you see that it has this grand strategy to continue in this direction? I mean, are there specific people sitting at the top of the weapons companies, in the Pentagon and elsewhere that are planning this and co-opting the people in the different leadership positions within the government, within the media, and elsewhere?
Well, it's hard for me to say that I have the evidence that shows there's a grand conspiracy or a grand strategy, but these are people doing what comes natural. And what comes natural to them is bigger and bigger defense budgets. Our spending now is at record levels for military equipment that can't even be used in the kinds of wars that we're fighting. You have industrial leaders who work with the Pentagon. You have general officers retiring and then going directly into the industrial side of the military-industrial complex. You have a Congress where you have very few senators and congressmen who have ever even served in the military, let alone have experience in wartime. You can count on the fingers of one hand those senators who have that kind of experience. And there's incredible deference toward the military, despite the serious failings we've seen of the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, this incredible deference. So there is no contrarian view or contrarian idea that's out there that's able to take on this view. And these very strong individuals who were very well placed throughout the military and throughout the industrial side of the military-industrial complex. And I think that is the problem. They're doing what they've been trained to do and what comes natural to them, which is to keep building large weapons platforms, keep expanding intelligence spending. Intelligence spending is now at $48 billion. That's more than the whole world spends on intelligence. The military budget is over $600 billion because at least now the Democrats have pushed the Iraqi and Afghan spending into the military budget, which is something George Bush didn't want to do. He wanted to keep that separate and compartmented and protected. And we're spending money at record rates, and now we want to expand the Army and the Marine Corps. Expand them to do what? To go where? Against what enemy? And in what way? And does any of this work against terrorism? And I think the answer there is we've learned, no, there are incredible weaknesses in terms of using the military in the so-called war against terror, which is sort of a doctrine or a policy or a strategy for continuous war. How do you break this cycle? How do you know when you've won? How do you know when the war is over? How do you know when the enemy has been engaged? So these are serious issues that no one is really discussing, and the Democrats are floundering around looking for an answer to the war, but have not stopped to, I think, debate some of the very essential questions about what are we doing with our military power and what can military power achieve. And, of course, the Iraq War is only one part of this disastrous equation that we're dealing with now.
So do you have any sense for what would be viable steps and or solutions on this? I mean, if we're looking at, it appears that, again, many people in key positions are compromised to one degree or another. Does that also speak to that the system itself has been completely compromised?
Well, I think the system has definitely been compromised. And I think where the Democrats have played into that compromise is not training people in the field of national security affairs. The Democrats have a very weak bench on national security matters. And they don't seem to have the special interest groups that respond very quickly to things that the Bush administration has done just in the last 6 years. When you think of their campaign against arms control and disarmament, their campaign against the ABM treaty, their campaign against arms control in general, where we could have really reduced strategic weapons with Russia, something that President Putin wanted to do, but George Bush had no interest in whatsoever, walking away from Middle East negotiations, not putting any pressure on Israel to enter into a dialogue with the Palestinians. We've walked away from so many diplomatic and negotiating opportunities. And, you know, as someone said, and I think it's a paraphrase of Mark Twain, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, all the problems are going to start to look like nails. And I think when the Bush administration looks around, North Korea is a nail to be pounded. Syria is a nail to be pounded. Iran is a nail to be pounded. And there's no negotiating opportunity that's really sought. You know, I'm not a great fan of Colin Powell, and I think he did a big disservice to the country when he didn't resign, given his opposition to the war. But Colin Powell at least understood the limits on the use of military power and spoke rather intelligently about what policy should look like toward North Korea and the Middle East and Iran. And I would like to see some Democrats, and I'm not saying this is a partisan issue here. I think it's important for the nation's self-interest that Democrats, if they're going to be in opposition to George Bush, and we know there is tremendous opposition, and we know that Iraq is the most profligate decision I think that any American president has ever made, still you need someone with national security credentials to debate this point of view. But so far, Chuck Hagel, the Republican from Nebraska, I think has had greater credibility than any Democrat I can think of. And when you look at the leadership against the torture and abuse policies that the military and the CIA were pursuing, it was 3 Republicans: John Warner from Virginia, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, and John McCain from Arizona, who led the opposition. And I don't think even their efforts were strong enough, and I don't think the Military Commission Act of 2006 went as far as it should have. But where were the Democrats? Where were the Democrats on warrantless eavesdropping? Now the Democrats are in control of the oversight committees. Why aren't they going after the intelligence community and subpoenaing people about warrantless eavesdropping of the National Security Agency, which is a violation of the Constitution, as I mentioned earlier? Or CIA people about torture and abuse in CIA facilities, secret prisons, extraordinary renditions. There are a lot of issues that need to be discussed, and I don't see Democratic spokesmen emerging in this debate. And now that you have a primary campaign season that has started too early, that's really the dumbing down of the whole political process, because everything gets leavened in such a way that it's all personality and no real substance is being discussed, and the media is comfortable with personality. Those are easy stories to write. Substantive issues are hard. They take a lot of research. They take a lot of shoe leather. You have to get out there and pursue these stories, and there's just not enough discussion in the country right now about important substantive matters.
Do you think we really have to, if we're going to be able to solve these problems, that we have to totally rethink our paradigms? For instance, the whole idea that, you know, if we had stronger Democrats and they stood up, comes from the fact that we're given 2 choices. You have a Republican or Democrat, you know, and no one even thinks the possibility of third party is viable, or that citizens standing up and speaking up against this is really a viable solution.
Yeah, I think we've become corporate in too many ways, and our political structure is a very corporate structure with 2 major political parties, looking at them as 2 major corporations in a sense, dominating the process. Money has become such a huge factor that it's hard for a third party or a third candidate to emerge in this system. But my concern right now is that you've had a war that's been going on since 2003. We know it is this profligate decision. We know it's been terribly mismanaged. We know that Americans are continuing to die, and there's no anti-war movement in this country. So we can talk about the parties and the process and the media and the Congress and the courts. Where are the people? You know, Margaret Mead said, you won't get change in this country until people seem to want change and demand change. And there's no national demand out there. I see no real national pressure on these parties to change very much. The elections of November suggested a certain amount of discontent. I just don't think the message was strong enough, and we don't vote again until November 2008. So what's going to happen between these two elections from 2006 to 2008? How much time is going to be lost? How much longer are we going to give to this surge strategy? And of course, we know it's not a strategy. It's just another tactic to prolong the war so that Bush can turn this war over to someone else in January 2009, when it'll be even a bigger mess than it is now. So it's this debate, this dialogue that needs to take place. And if a third candidate emerges out of that, if a spokesman for new ideas emerges, that would be a wonderful thing, but it would be a very difficult process. You know, it's kind of tragic. When you look at Ralph Nader and his third party candidacy, it was because he couldn't tell the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and he thought the American people needed a choice. Now, I happen to think he was right, but now he's blamed for Gore's defeat in 2000, and some of that blame is probably accurate as well if you look at the votes that Nader siphoned off of Gore in very important states and areas in the year 2000. So it's just very difficult for an independent in any field, including politics, to break into this process.
Speaking of the anti-war movement, within that, one of the things that really energized it not too long ago was an individual, Cindy Sheehan, who went to Texas and began her stand there that just kind of had this natural grassroots mushrooming of resistance. To me, that seems like a good example of an individual that out of the blue did something that broke all the rules and no one was expecting and just took off.
Well, it took off. I don't think it was. I went out to Austin, Texas around the time of those demonstrations at Crawford. It was never as big as I think Cindy Sheehan's supporters wanted it to be. And it didn't have any bounce. It never went anywhere. From Cindy Sheehan, who was very important at what she did, and I don't want to dismiss or marginalize her role because it was essential. She was a rallying point for the anti-war movement. But the fact is there is no anti-war movement in this country. And again, the corporate interest moved away from Cindy Sheehan. She made them uncomfortable. Now, I think it's important that we become uncomfortable. War should make all of us uncomfortable. War is a very outrageous way to solve problems. And this was a problem that we had with Iraq that was very limited in scope and could have been resolved without war. We didn't need to go to war to deal with weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist and links to terrorists that really didn't take place either, for that matter. So Cindy Sheehan was right in bringing a certain amount of emotional commitment to this issue, but it never really went anywhere. And I don't think the establishment, the anti-war establishment, embraced Cindy Sheehan. The great problem for me is the deal that Nixon made with the middle classes of America to do away with the draft. And I was opposed to doing away with the draft because I think the founding fathers, and we should remind ourselves about what they wanted in terms of the American system, they would have liked the draft. They would have been very leery about a professional military and a professional army to wage our battles, because that's where we are now. We have a professional military, which allows most of the people in the country saying, I don't fight these wars. We have a group of people who do that. That is their profession. And because their children are not subjected to the draft, neither the children nor their middle-class parents get out on the streets about a war they are opposed to. Because as I travel around the country, I gather there's tremendous opposition, but you can't translate the energy of that opposition into anything meaningful or into anything that links with other kinds of activity. So you can't get people on the streets, and you can't get people to write letters to their congressmen or to their newspapers expressing their views about this war, which are by and large negative.
So would reimposing the draft be one of your solutions for fixing the system?
Well, you ask me now a very uncomfortable question, but I hate to be tilting at the windmill of the draft and supporting the draft, but I think yes. I don't think you'll get the nation involved in decisions about war versus peace and moral war versus immoral war, and wars that should be fought, that are wars of necessity, and wars that should not be fought, such as wars of choice, such as Iraq, without a draft hanging over our heads. And I realize there will be no groundswell of support. There are a couple people in the Congress. Charles Rangel, from time to time, tests the waters about the draft. There's no interest there. But I do think without the draft, we'll never get the American people involved. Look how long it's taken to get some engagement about this war. 4 years of this preposterous war and this unnecessary killing and the unnecessary destruction of an Islamic country and unprecedented chaos in an important region that will remain important to us because we have no energy policy to begin with. And we just allow this to go on and on and on.
So if you were suddenly placed in charge of the progressive movement in this country, what solutions would you try and implement?
Well, the 3 steps that I would start with immediately would be, 1, in the energy area, to lessen our dependence on oil and then, therefore, lessen our dependence on the chaos and discontinuity of politics in the Middle East that we must free ourselves from sooner rather than later. 2, ending the war. And 3, returning to a multilateral way of conducting our diplomacy and our international relations, in which we work within international organizations such as the United Nations and the Security Council, and work within multinational groupings to develop genuine consensus for arms control and non-proliferation strategies. It cannot be done unilaterally. And the thing that concerns me, that is a background to all of these 3 ideas or instruments, is this insidious notion that we're a superpower. And now, of course, it's become even more dangerous. We think we're the only superpower. And now we see superpower in terms of what? What can we do with this superpower status? We're making no satisfactory success or impact on Afghanistan, and no satisfactory impact on Iraq with all of our military power. So until we learn the limits and the constraints on the use of military power and the importance of diplomacy and international negotiation, I think we're going to be blundering into these situations such as Iraq. We've learned very little from Vietnam, and now I fear we'll learn very little from Iraq, and that's what I think is so worrisome.
Right. What would you recommend to individual listeners to do, since one of the paradigms we're given is your vote doesn't count, one person really can't do anything?
Well, I think that's the wrong lesson. It's almost a cynical kind of lesson when you reach the point where your vote doesn't count because of the large size of this country and the huge political groupings that we try to operate in. I think until we get engaged, and engagement may be meaning a letter that needs to be written to a congressman, or a letter that should be written to a newspaper, or a phone call to a congressional office where they have to record the positions, where you stand up and you go to a meeting and you make yourself heard in some way, or you attend a rally. And a lot of people have never gone to a political rally of any type. Until we get these people who have been so disengaged more active, I think it's going to be very difficult to put pressure on our political leaders to get real change in the political process and change in our policies. And that's what we need to do.
All right. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I just want to thank you for the time you made available for this. I think that progressive radio really is doing the work that the media in terms of corporate television and corporate press have not done. And I think in some ways the radio airwaves have been essential in this campaign to just get a greater dialogue on these issues in front of the American people. So I want to thank you, Mike, for what you've done. All
right. We've just been talking with Melvin Goodman. He is former CIA and State Department analyst and co-author of the book Bush League Diplomacy: How the Neoconservatives Are Putting the World at Risk.